Hello and welcome to another webinar for the Association for Size, Diversity and Health. My name is Dawn Clifford and I'm with the ASDA, and I am the chair of the Education Committee, and we're just so excited to be able to bring you another amazing webinar. Today's topic is Healthism, and we've invited Dana Sturdivant and Hillary Canavy to present on this important topic. And I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing our speakers, and then they will take it away. So in 2006, Hillary and Dana co-founded Be Nourished, and you can check out their website, a revolutionary business helping people heal body dissatisfaction and reclaim body trust. Hillary is a licensed professional counselor, a certified Daring Way facilitator, and a transformational workshop leader. And Dana is a registered dietitian and a motivational interviewing trainer and a yoga instructor. And after many years of deep listening, learning, and working with their clients at Be Nourished, Hillary and Dana co-created Body Trust Wellness, which is a curriculum that encourages people to move towards a compassionate model of radical self-care to heal body shame and patterns of chronic dieting and disordered eating. Dana and Hillary were so excited that you agreed and offered and volunteered to provide this webinar on Healthism, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say today. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Dawn. Thank you. We're very excited to be here, talk about how Healthism overshadows healing. I'm going to share my screen. So I think we are good to go. We're here to, describe the difference between how do we promote health versus healing. This is something we talk a lot about with our clients, is what's the difference between health versus healing. We'll talk a bit about how shame plays an often hidden role in our interactions, talk about some of the ethical dilemmas that come up when we're offering behavioral prescriptions, and then offer some tools and strategies to help you as you move forward after this presentation. If you look up the word healthism in Google, you'll probably come across this Robert Crawford definition. I was fascinated that this term was coined in 1980, and here we are 36 years later, really talking about this. The word ism, I'm going to be talking about nutritionism as well, and the word ism implies an ideology, which is different than a scientific subject. And healthism basically is living in a culture that believes that health is the be-all and end-all to our existence. Healthism sees health as the property and responsible of the individual and ignores the impact of trauma, poverty, abuse, war, even the environmental impacts on health, and has a lot of negative consequences, including victim blaming, reinforcing privilege, increasing health inequalities, and fostering internalized oppression. We often tell our clients that their worthiness is not dependent on their health status. I find myself talking a lot about personal responsibility rhetoric. And healthism really shapes our beliefs, and this personal responsibility rhetoric ignores the enormous disparities in our healthcare system and in our society. Basically, healthism says if you get sick, it's your fault. This next slide talks about nutritionism, which again, the ism implies another ideology. It's not scientific. And it's this fixation on nutrients at the expense of the context and experiential knowledge of food and eating. And it results in a lot of nutrition confusion where people end up thinking they need a nutrition expert to tell them how to eat and what to eat. If you've ever read my bio, I say in there that most of my clients know way too much about food and nutrition, and the last thing they need is somebody else telling them what what's good and what's not good to have. Nutritionism dumbs food down. It robs it of its meaning. I remember reading years ago or coming across this idea that animals feed while human beings dine. I'll say that again. That animals feed, they eat, while human beings dine. We come to the table, we commune through food. It's flavored with meaning. And this gets lost in the culture of nutritionism. There are several unexamined assumptions about nutritionism. We think that the key to understanding food is indeed in the nutrients, that foods are essentially the sum of their parts. And this has played a huge role in the increase of the processed food industry. I remember in Michael Pollan's book, In Defense of Food, he talked about how when companies were able to get rid of the word imitation, when the labeling laws changed, and companies could get rid of the word imitation cheese, imitation this, imitation that, that people used to not buy things when they said imitation, but as soon as they got rid of that word, the sale of these processed foods increased. And nutritionism, thinking food is the sum of its nutrients, gave rise to this processed food industry. It also believes that the whole purpose of eating is to maintain and promote bodily health. And this is not something that is viewed by all cultures. Many cultures see food as part of pleasure. It's a huge part of socializing, and it's a huge part of people's identity. I often tell clinicians that when we start to mess with people's food, we're starting to mess with their lives, their culture, their family history, their relationships. And nutritionism basically promotes this dualistic thinking where for every good nutrient, there must be a bad one. And it leads to fad diets and huge shifts in the nutritional pendulum. Meaning, you know, if you think about like the 90s, it was all about low fat. And then it was about low carb. And now like paleo seems to be the thing where it's a lot of meat and vegan, and you have vegan paleos, which I don't even know what that is. And then you have the raw foodies thinking the macrobiotics are nuts, and the macrobiotics think the raw foodies are not. The vegetarians think the paleo people are wrong. The paleo people think the vegetarians are wrong. And in all of this, people end up really confused.
Because it's become very complicated.
It's become really complicated. And many of our clients have chronic dieting histories, and they've been on diets that contradict themselves. So they'll be on a low carb diet, and then they'll be on a high carb diet, and then they'll be, you know, low fat diet, high fat diet. And people end up having a really hard time navigating food choices with all these ideas in their heads, and they end up leading with their heads instead of connecting to the information that their body gives them about what, when, and how much to eat. Another thing I want to talk about briefly is just dieting culture, that we live in a culture of dieting. We often get indoctrinated into this culture before we can even consent. Most of our clients by the age of 9 or 10 have been indoctrinated into dieting culture. It's really normalizes calorie counting and food-associated shame. It gives rise to the dieting mind, which we'll talk about in a little bit, in a moment. And I think of it giving rise to the cosmetic fitness industry, you know, where there's this focus more on cosmetic fitness than metabolic fitness. It's more about looking healthy than actually being healthy. And sometimes I think about dieting as a religion, you know, that we're worshiping thinness under the guise of health. And so people are living in this healthist, nutritionism, dieting culture. And few of us are immune to this. We could never diet, and most people will use good and bad language when they talk about what they eat. So what is this dieting mind? Well, it's treating your body like a machine, this mechanistic thinking that we can control things and it can be tightly regulated. And many people find that when the more restrained they are in their eating, the less of a social life they have. It interferes because, again, animals feed while human beings dine. A lot of people's social life goes out the window when they're preoccupied with what they're eating and what their weight is. Dieting mind also might be consuming a lot of things to numb hunger: water, coffee, high caffeine foods. People might be chewing a lot of gum or sucking on candies to avoid eating. And lastly, it really promotes that dichotomous thinking about food: good, bad, healthy, unhealthy. People need time to heal the dieting mind. They need time to heal their relationship with food and body before they start thinking about their health and or the quality of food that they're eating. And I think this is one aspect that people can really collude with the dieting mind unknowingly, is when they tell people, you know, we're not dieting here, we're just going to be healthy, we're just going to watch what we're eating. And if you have somebody that lives in a dieting culture and has adopted this dieting mind, focusing on healthy lifestyle changes without addressing and healing the dieting mind is just going to be another diet to your patients.
And so we want to just mention that the work that we do at Be Nourished has served a particular population. The clients we see are typically people who have chronically dieted, people who are really motivated by changing their bodies because of the amount of body shame that they have internalized, or the amount of due to the amount of weight stigma in our culture. We serve folks that have eating disorders or subclinical eating disorders, referred to as disordered eating. The populations we see are highly stigmatized, as I mentioned. They're reminded to lose weight on a regular basis by medical professionals. They believe that they've failed terribly at that. They see that as a product of their own weakness, not so much as a condition of culture or as a natural side effect of dieting. And the people that we see are often very traumatized, whether they've experienced trauma in earlier life or whether living with internalized depression has repeated trauma over and over again and cemented body shame within their experience. So you may be very familiar with chronic dieters in your work as well. We know that chronic dieting follows a particular cycle, and that the cycle can last anywhere from a very short amount of time, a couple of minutes even, to a year or more in someone's life. Chronic dieters tend to have a strong desire to change the size, shape, or weight of their body, and that can be because of their own discomfort living in their body as it is. It could also be because they've been told to lose weight, or because our culture has such an emphasis on thinness, they may feel that their own body is somehow substandard and needs to be altered. Chronic dieters tend to make a plan, and the plan can be anything from one of these more formal fad diets to a diet offered by a healthcare professional to a plan like, I'm only going to eat vegetables, or I'm going to make sure I run every day, or I'm going to make up for my bad behavior by doing this. The thing about most of the plans that are offered, whether they're offered by a professional, which we're going to be talking more about today, or whether they are a fad diet, or whether they are something that the client, the person invents for themselves, is that very few plans are going to be able to be sustained because of the way life works. We're going to talk more about shame in a little bit, but any plan rooted in shame doesn't tend to stick. And we also know, as members of ASDA, that diets themselves are unsustainable and ineffective. The problem is that when diets fail, when the plan fails, many people blame themselves. And there can be a lot of need to comfort and cope. So there can be backlash eating, there can be further internalization of failure, there can be an enormous amount of emotional side effects that come from a plan not working for someone. Sometimes people regain weight if there's been any weight loss. Usually there is an increased sense of disembodiment, move away from the body instead of towards the body. There's a less curiosity about their experience and more self-blame and self-harm. And then people tend to find themselves circling back around to that plan all over again, trying something new. We've noticed over the years that people who chronically diet tend to lose tolerance to dieting over time. So they may have been able to pull off a diet for a significant period of time. And then the further along they go, the less amount of time they're able to sustain any particular plan or diet. And we also know that this dieting cycle is seen as quite a normal thing. It's something that a lot of people identify with. It's something that people are trying to beat, and it's not seen as problematic in and of itself. The dieting cycle is seen as something that people are supposed to be able to somehow gain power over or win or master somehow. Our focus in our work is helping people heal their relationship to food. And what we often, when we're meeting with a new group of people, tend to ask them to describe their relationship with food, what it is currently and what they'd like it to be ideally. And what's particularly interesting about this is that if our clients are coming to us with a particularly insecure or troubled relationship with food or their body, the medicine that's needed, thus the support that should be offered, is not more perfection around food. What's needed is something that's going to heal the relationship with food and move them towards a style and an experience with food that's going to make them feel more competent and less powerless. And so as you see, when you look down the list of their ideal relationship with food, they're not seeking something that's perfect. They're not seeking something that is right. They're seeking something that is safe and non-judgmental and not shaming. And they're trying to figure out how to achieve that within themselves. And I think this slide is really key. I think it's worth looking at for a moment or two, because essentially, if you're wanting to help people have a relationship with food that moves them towards a sense of well-being, it's important to know that what we're healing is not the food itself. And I'm guessing that many of you that are listening are familiar with how widespread disordered eating is in our country. And this, according to this statistic, 20 million women and 10 million men suffer from clinically significant eating disorders, which means that they meet diagnostic criteria. I think if we were able to get clear numbers on how many people engage in disordered eating, it would be shocking and far larger than this 20 million.
Be the
10
norm.
million number. It would be the norm. It's certainly what we see coming into our office. And eating disorders that meet criteria for diagnostic criteria are, of course, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, or something that we've been calling eating disorder, NOS. And there's an emerging eating disorder called orthorexia that may be considered for the next DSM. And orthorexia is absolutely tied to healthism. It's really hard to talk about healthism without thinking about orthorexia in our work, because orthorexia is less motivated by thinness and more of a motivation to eat very healthy and purely and naturally. And the symptoms of orthorexia is really about maintaining a strict diet and receiving and feeling a sense of elevation in one's own sense of worthiness as a result. There's a high degree of guilt and concern if their diet isn't perfect. There's a lot of time spent thinking about food. There's a lot of concern about processed food. It's highly perfectionistic. And it can be highly associated with anxiety and GI distress, which of course is something that's that we're finding everyone's talking a lot more about, but isn't always attributed to the relationship with food, but often the food itself. And it's also important for us to take a moment and just begin to touch on the impact of weight stigma in terms of the populations we serve. Weight stigma really limits people's power. I think weight stigma is often introduced in healthcare communities as concern trolling or as a necessity to motivate people to move towards health. And it exists in our culture and has very free reign. Weight isn't often even included when we're in in populations that are discussing marginalization and oppression. It's something that still is needed to be included more in our discussions about inclusion. But weight stigma is clearly sanctioned by the culture. Weight stigma allows us to get away with the idea that somehow thinness equals health. Weight stigma is victim blaming and allows people to portray fat people or people in larger bodies in a particularly negative way. Weight stigma completely ignores the complexity of weight science. It's an exercise. It's a way of oppressing people. It totally ignores the fact that oppression and stigma and things like environmental racism and intersectional identities play a part in people's identities. And weight stigma and the pervasiveness of it is certainly inviting us to, as a community who's particularly interested in weight stigma, to reconceptualize the way we see trauma and how it relates to stigma. We know, for instance, that weight stigma is often internalized and hurts one's sense of self. And we also know that trauma has a similar effect, that traumatic events, the very definition of trauma is that traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care inside a person that give people a sense of control and connection and meaning. And we know that there are different forms of trauma. So there's type 1 trauma, which is a single event trauma. Type 2 involves multiple events of traumatic experience in someone's life. And there's also an interest in introducing a type 3 trauma, which is more interested in looking at how there are certain events that people experience in the culture that affects their sense of identity. And so here we are as a population wanting to address size and offer inclusion to people around size and promote health and wellness for people of all sizes. And it's literally, in my experience as a clinician, impossible to have those conversations without being able to include discussions of trauma.
I've been noticing in my work that I just think growing up female in this culture is trauma. I think that third type of trauma you were speaking to is that kind of trauma, that just being born as a female and the pressures on females to meet a certain ideal is trauma, regardless of what other kinds of trauma that we experience.
Yeah, I think in the literature around that third type of trauma, they're looking at, the impact of mental health stigma around, in combination with, other marginalized identities and how that impacts people. And I guess in my own wondering about this work, I'm wondering if we can also move in the direction of including weight stigma as something when combined with other identities that can be particularly traumatic. The thing about trauma is that we're not talking about it. We're not talking about it in our office. I'm talking about it in my office because I'm a therapist and there's some understanding that I've been trained to do so. However, the data that's emerging around particularly from the ACE study, really is making this really powerful connection. That is that if we aren't talking about trauma in our offices, then we're doing a disservice to people. And that being able to offer discussion about how one's experiences has affected their sense of self and their sense of identity is essential to moving people and to supporting people and moving towards health.
There was one thing I read preparing for this that said just a physician just openly discussing trauma with the patient reduces their medical visits by 35%. Just allowing people to tell their story. So often they don't even expect you to do anything to fix it, but just to acknowledge that people have these complex stories and histories, and what it does to just hold space for the story reduces medical visits by 35%.
It's pretty remarkable. And it's challenging. There's been multiple settings that I've worked in that even in mental health, we aren't particularly using a trauma-informed approach. And I'm guessing for many of you who aren't trained in mental health and don't come from a mental health model, may feel very intimidated by figuring out how to include a trauma-informed approach in your work. This slide expresses the principles that have been proposed by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for what a trauma-informed approach involves or includes. And the first of that is safety, which just means that in your setting that your clients get to feel physically and psychologically safe, that there's room for them both physically and emotionally, that the physical setting is safe, and the interpersonal interactions highlight safety first. And trustworthy and transparency specifically speaks to making sure that that relationships are coming first in interactions, that there's an emphasis on building trust and enhancing collaboration, and that there's a focus on enhancing for the client first, and instead of making sure that the client is there to accomplish the tasks that the organization has set forth is most important. Collaboration and mutuality speaks to bringing some transparency to leveling power differences between providers and clients or patients. It demonstrates that, most importantly, that healing is happening within the relationships and that it isn't put off to be handled by someone else who's nameless and faceless and maybe not even on the team. This in particular highlights that one does not have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And I know that that might bring up a lot of worry and concern or anxiety for non-therapists, but we're going to talk more about that in this talk later on. Empowerment, voice, and choice speaks to highlighting the strengths and experiences of someone, that perhaps if someone lives in their body, that they have a high degree of expertise about their experience, and that we're working on fostering a belief in resilience and ability in individuals, regardless of what their experience, regardless of what's in front of them. And finally, the cultural, historic, and gender issues request that organizations move past cultural stereotypes and biases. There's a need for us to know that we may never be perfect in being able to recognize our bias, but that we can actively seek to acknowledge them and are open to feedback around them. And we want to make sure also that this includes not only race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, geography, but also size, which isn't actually included in the principles. So I'd like to see it there. All right.
Missing again.
Missing again and again and again. So when we're considering moving towards a trauma-informed approach, it's important to know that it just may take a while for us to get a holistic view. But according to this doctor who studies trauma-informed approach in primary care services, there's really no way that we can begin to deliver better care at lower costs, if that's a concern to your organization, without fully being inclusive of your patient's life history, experiences, sense of self, the identity politics they've experienced, and so on and so on.
There was an estimate I was reading that said that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, estimates that trauma-related illness costs the medical industry $124 billion a year. And I think so much of this trauma-informed, as somebody who's extensively trained and trains people in motivational interviewing, it just makes me think about how we hold space for people is the most helpful thing about us. And that therapists don't have, the market on how to help people heal, that we can have that our relationship with our clients, our patients, is the most powerful thing about us. and the things we do to nurture that rapport so much come back to this slide of, safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment. I just think so much about that training. And
it's always been one of the most difficult things to understand for me as a therapist as to why we haven't empowered other allied professionals to learn how to hold space and sit with people, and how we've somehow, the very separation of that speaks so strongly to the separation of mind and body that we experience in this culture. But as I train other professionals, it's very clear that people are really desiring and needing that kind of training, because people see what's in front of them, and it's very difficult on everyone in the room when you don't feel adequate to move towards what's needed the most.
And yeah, it makes me think of that writing reflex, and how when we're listening to somebody who's gone through a tough time or has had a difficult time, that there's a strong part of human nature to want to fix it.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people get concerned about, like, if I welcome the client's story into my office, then I have to do something to fix it.
Right.
When they don't just see that just simply welcoming the person's story into the office and giving them a few minutes to talk about it reduces medical visits by 35%.
I know, it's quite remarkable.
Like, you can just let them tell the story.
Well, and I love that writing reflex is called the reflex of the heart, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think so many people are wanting to be able to deepen and to have these conversations, and have been made to feel that they're inadequate to do so. And we're here to tell you that may not be true.
Yeah. That listening and holding space empathically and safely goes a long way to help people heal. Ooh, I feel like we got on a roll there.
I know.
Okay.
Back to the slides.
Back to the slides. So how do we define health? When we look at the Healthism, it's very healthist that, ASDA took some time to come up with a more holistic definition of health. It's a broad definition. I remember seeing an interaction on Facebook in one of the Hayes communities that somebody said, it exists on a continuum, that when we're born into this world, we are on some spectrum of healthy, unhealthy, and we stay on that spectrum throughout a lifetime. There's no place that we arrive in terms of health. At Be Nourished, we often talk about health and in a way of like keeping the lens wide, where, we don't just focus on behaviors and choices. We keep the lens wide and, acknowledge how trauma impacts health, and how socioeconomic status impacts health, and how stress impacts health. And, while we give lip service to stress, we're not doing much to help people with their stress. We can give lip service to it, but struggle to speak openly about what people are really experiencing in their lives and what's really affecting their health. And when people are focused on weight, and think they need to change the size or shape of their body, that zoom lens goes into what am I eating and how am I exercising? And we get this really narrow view. And when we widen the lens, we start to see all the things that impact health. I'm always fascinated, and I think one of the most powerful things I say to some of my clients is, I'm so interested in how I'm hearing all the things you've dealt with in your life, and your body has somehow become the problem.
Yeah, the body is such a metaphor, right?
Like, you've been through divorce, you've been through abuse, you've been through all these things, and somehow your body's the problem.
I know.
It's not that you're working 70 hours a week or...
Yeah, I've been carrying so much survival for so long. It reminds me of something I've heard Amy Pershing say, which is, in a lot of this healing work, we're moving from, in terms of the dieting culture, we're moving from body as billboard, right? Like, if I can just get my body all right, if I can get it looking all right, somehow the stuff that I carry on the inside will be less visible and then maybe less problematic to me. And she says, we're moving from body as billboard to body as home. How do I begin? What is needed for me to begin to be able to occupy my body again with less shame, with less regret, with less disgust, particularly for our clientele?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I think what prompted this talk probably is, how do we do health at every size without being promoting healthism and being healthist? And I think about this work, oftentimes Hillary and I talk about this work as relationship work. And even the paper that this comes from says theorizing health at every size is a relational cultural endeavor. And this work is relationship work in all kinds of ways. There's the relationship between the provider and the patient. There's the relationship with self. You as a provider, your own relationship with self, your patient's relationship with themselves, their relationship with their body, their relationship with food, and the metaphors abound in this work. This quote I've come across recently several times, and I just love this. I think it really encourages us to resist that writing reflex, that need to fix. You know, this idea that if you've come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your own liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.
You know, many of the providers we work with who are wanting to learn this approach really want a place where they can acknowledge that they're in the soup pot too. You know, that the dieting culture impacts all of us. The weight stigma impacts all of us, some more than others, of course, but that we're all in this, and that we may have our own feelings about our bodies. We may have our own feelings about the ways that we've been marginalized, or you know, our identities have been impacted by the cultural mainstream. And that part of this work is about being in it together and noticing that we all have a degree of vulnerability as we move into this work together. And how do we, as clinicians, as helpers, begin to hold space for our own process and hold space for the work we're doing with our clients and patients as well.
Yeah, as I was preparing for this, I thought, you know, I wonder how your work might change if you showed up with your in your patient interactions with this quote in mind. You know, that your liberation is bound up with mine, and let us work together. Like, I just think so much would shift in how we would even hold space and show up when this is kind of the compass we're using to navigate things. You know, this relationship work is an opportunity for healing. And again, our focus is on healing, not health. When we think there's a difference between focusing on healing versus health. A huge part of people want to feel in control. It's a strong desire of human beings. I mean, I think a lot of orthorexia and a lot of healthism is rooted in this belief that we can control things. And people want agency. They want to believe that they have control. And when we give information and advice, it oftentimes feels like we're taking away control and choice. We want to empower our patients by eliciting from them rather than imparting. My mentor, Steve Berg-Smith, says, you know, Dana, the answer is often in the room. Your job is to ask the right questions, not to provide the answer. So when we start listening, what do you think? Where do you think we go from here? You're tapping into the client's wisdom and supporting a sense of self-efficacy, as well as supporting their own autonomy. You know, the research shows that most of the advice we have to offer people has already been thought of and rejected by them. And so when we take time to elicit from them, we avoid getting into that place where people get frustrated because you're telling them things they already know. And I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again, that your presence, how you hold space with people, is the most motivating and helpful thing about you. Not the advice you give, not the handouts you have. We think, you know, the world needs more embodied practitioners. We believe we cannot help our clients go farther than they've gone. And we think a big part of helping people heal relationship with food and body is understanding our own relationship with food and body and how they might influence and impact what we do with people when they're sitting across from us. A huge part of our work is practicing what we preach. And an embodied practitioner is not one that never has bad body days, but one that knows how to navigate those days without being destructive to themselves. And so when we went to an intuitive eating, I think it was the very first intuitive eating training that Evelyn and Elise did.
It was like 10 years ago.
Yeah,
probably.
They put this slide up, what is your dieting history? What are your own food rules and food philosophies? How comfortable are you with your body? Because when you sit across from people day after day, chances are, because you have a relationship with your own body and food, it's going to be impacted. And the more embodied and the more resilient you yourself have become to living in a world full of weight bias, the more able you're going to be to help other people do that. These ethical considerations for providers come out of Linda and Lucy's article on weight science, that, we have some ethics of doing no harm and actually doing some good. I remember them saying, if you were sitting across from someone who is in a smaller body, what recommendations would you have for this ailment that they're complaining of? That we don't withhold treatments, and kind of a lot of providers dangle weight loss and, surgery. They have to lose weight. That we do some good, we do no harm, that the treatment must be necessary. And I love this idea when we're working from a health at every size perspective, and you work for an organization that maybe wants you to be rooted more in the traditional weight paradigm, that we highlight informed consent, that we let people know what the likely outcomes are of going on another diet, and inform them that there is another paradigm, health at every size, and that they get to make an informed decision about where they go with that. Chances are they're very ambivalent about it. Most of our clients have not hit dieting bottom and are not ready to give up the dream of being thin, but we can help them understand why we do the work we do and have the philosophy we have, and allow them to be ambivalent about it while we are supportive to them. As you can see, a big part of ethics is practitioner resilience, and we'll be talking about that towards the end of our presentation today. I think sometimes the most healing thing we can sometimes say is, it's not your fault.
That is one of the first things that we say around here, especially when we're considering, the soup again, what we're all in, the amount of trauma people experience in their lives, dieting culture, the lens of weight stigma, the marginalization of people for all their identities. We have to acknowledge the ways people cope and the wisdom they source, and their coping that they source. It makes perfect sense that it was needed, that it wasn't their fault, that it was really rooted in wisdom, the ways people have learned to cope in the world.
And sometimes Hillary, I think, says, this isn't about fixing, this is about healing. And we think even those words there's something different there, but people oftentimes come in and feel broken. The dieting culture and the dieting cycle definitely make people feel like there's something wrong with them. There's a lot of internalized blame and shame. And I think a huge part of healing is starting to externalize that anger. It's been internalized towards themselves, and it's starting to get angry at the culture and the community that has promoted something that has such a huge failure rate. I think, and it's not your fault really speaks to trauma that impacts health. It's just a much more inclusive way of looking at what's going on in somebody's life. We're moving away from this word control discourse. This is a word that Lucy Afframore used in that paper, Theorizing Health at Every Size as a Relational Cultural Endeavor, where we're handing down treatment to the problematic person and their challenged body. And we're moving away from that mechanistic thinking of calories in, calories out, and just reinforcing the complexity of people's experiences as a human being in the world. I love Anne Lamott. She says, it's getting a little lifey around here. You got to remember that people's lives are happening day after day after day, and life is often overwhelming for them. And one of the best things we can do as a helping professional is not to contribute to the overwhelm and the shame. To control discourse, she says, it withholds the power from the other by undermining the client's knowledge and relationship with their bodies and reifying the provider's knowledge. So again, people thinking they need experts to tell them what to do, when to eat, how much to move. And we're trying to move away from this discourse to empower them. To we often say you were born into the world knowing when you're hungry and knowing when you're full. And if I have all the control, you're not going to have the healing and the success you're looking for.
Or the experience of knowing yourself more fully, knowing your body, moving towards a sense of embodiment, if that's something that they're interested in doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to move into talking a little bit more about conversation strategies and tools that we use here at Be Nourished. And I want to acknowledge a couple things as I'm moving into this. One is, some of you may be wondering, well, I came into this work to talk about health, and now are they saying I can't talk about health? And what we're highlighting is that part of our work may be to broaden the lens on health, as we talked about before, looking at that as the definition of health. And how do we, even if it hasn't been what our profession has prescribed, how do we widen our understanding of what health is and help the people we work with self-define what health means for them, after offering them informed consent and all those things about dieting culture. It's also important to acknowledge that you're not alone if you're feeling concerned about implementing some of the tools and strategies that we're talking about here. Well, the majority of providers, particularly in more traditional medical model settings, really cite that there's quite a few things that make them feel inadequate to start talking to clients from a trauma-informed place, or holding space more therapeutically with clients. Most people feel like it's going to take a lot of time. They feel like they don't have the awareness, they don't have the tools, they don't have the training. And honestly, and this is what I wonder about, I wonder if this is primarily that there's a lot of discomfort. Like, there's a sense that you can do it wrong. There's a sense that you're not adequate, or that you don't know how. And in this next section, we want to talk a little bit more about what's going on there, maybe for you, maybe also for the people you're serving. And hopefully you'll walk away from the rest of this with just one or two ideas that feel comfortable to you. And as with everything we offer, the invitation here is to take what you want and leave the rest. Okay, so don't worry about all of it. Don't try to get an A. We're going after C work around here. So, helping without harming. As we talked about, rapport is the most important thing. I went to, counseling school, and in counseling school, I think we spent a great deal of our time talking about rapport. How do we put the relationship first? It's well documented in counseling education that the relationship is the most healing part of interactions with people. And I don't think that's just in the therapy room. I think that's in most interactions with health professionals. And so that's something to keep in mind. Like, how do I make enough time to create a relationship with someone? We are going to talk in a bit more detail in a moment about shame and about empathy. So you can have maybe a deeper understanding of what those things look and feel like. We're going to talk about the importance of assessing relationship with food and body, especially before offering behavioral or food prescriptions. We're going to be talking about this idea of embodiment and body trust, the work we do around here. And we also know that can be really helpful if we just widen the lens on the meaning of food overall, that food is not simple, it's not just fuel for most people, and that we do a great service to people if we acknowledge the complexity of it. But let's start with shame. Why not, right?
We feel like our clients roll their eyes when we say,
I know.
We see this bring up shame and grief. It's like, oh God, can they get through a session without talking about shame and grief?
And the truth is we cannot. So I'm trained in Brene Brown's research and work, and I particularly lean into her definition of shame, and because I think it's very helpful. It's important to know that shame is she says is a universal feeling. It's something everyone experiences. It's not just for people who have experienced certain kinds of abuse, but it's something that we all feel on a regular basis. And shame is that intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed, and therefore, because of the flaw, unworthy of love and belonging. And I think this definition is powerful because I think it's easy to relate to, that somehow this flaw in us, that I'm not the right color, that I'm not the right shape, that I do the wrong things, makes me unworthy of love and belonging. And the thing that shame creates is a need to hustle, right? A need to develop, to come up with strategies and ways of coping that somehow are going to bring me more in alignment with what the culture deems worthy of love and belonging. But the problem is that shame doesn't work, right? If shame worked, we would all be out of a job. I would be selling shoes or something. I think that shame fuels unsustainable action, and it does from both sides of the clinical interaction. If we are introducing behavior change strategies that are attempting to negate the shame that someone's feeling, they don't stick. So if someone is feeling like, if I can just do more control over my food, somehow I'll feel better about my body, we need to know that controlling food is not the thing that controlling food has never made shame feel better for anything more than a moment. And that for our clients, that if they attempt to change something because they feel in deep shame about it, the intervention is not going to stick very long. And so one of the most powerful things we can do as providers is just acknowledge that shame might be in the room. You might be feeling it, they might be feeling it. If you're feeling it, they're probably feeling it. And it's something, as I said, we all have. We are all afraid to talk about it. I don't like to talk about it, and I talk about it all day. But the thing about shame is it amplifies itself. So the less we talk about it, the more there is. And it's important to know, one of the most valuable things you can do in a session with someone is address how their worthiness is tied to their desire for change. And that can be simply naming it. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we could give you something very simple that would make you feel better about yourself? Wouldn't it be nice if it worked that way? Unfortunately, it doesn't. There are some kryptonite. There's some kryptonite out there for shame, and there are two words that are used a lot that I don't think we have a great depth of understanding about, and that is self-compassion, and that is empathy. And the video this slide refers to is a little animated video that Brene Brown made. I think there's like a fox. If you Google it, you'll find it. Empathy video, Brene Brown.
And there's a link there.
There's a link, yeah. So when you look at the slides, you'll be able to get to the link. But it's, we're going to talk a little bit more about empathy, but I want to take a moment to note self-compassion. We are particularly motivated by Kristen Neff's research and work around self-compassion, and that self-compassion is not just being nice to yourself, although that's a big part of it. Self-compassion involves being able to get within yourself and have enough, increase your capacity to non-judgmentally watch your own actions and be kind about the humanity that's behind most of the actions, most of the ways that we maybe feel like we're failing on a regular basis. But most important, and the thing I want to highlight about self-compassion, is that we increase in self-compassion. We have a sense that our suffering aligns us more with humanity than separates us. And that is true. We all suffer. We all experience shame. We all experience rejection. And sometimes as a clinician, if it's a way that you can highlight how someone's suffering or struggle brings them closer to your experience or closer to the experience of most humans, it can have a large impact on the person you're serving. And empathy is a word that gets passed around a lot, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about empathy. One of the primary ones is that we all just have it. Actually, empathy is something that's learned, and likely you learned it as a child, but learning how to offer it clinically is very much a practice. I often feel inadequate at the way I'm offering empathy, and I often blow it. And I think that's The other important thing about empathy is that we fail at it regularly, even if we're supposedly practiced and skilled at offering it. Empathy is someone really showing up for someone purely just for whatever they're sharing with you. So it doesn't involve anything that's happening within you other than feeling with the person. It's non-judgmental. It places whatever feelings are coming from the person you're with first, no matter what they are. There's no correction of the feelings. There's a simple naming of the feelings. Empathy communicates understanding of the feelings, and empathy can always be corrected. And I think that's the most powerful thing about it, that if you feel like maybe you haven't adequately shown up for something somebody's saying to you, you can always circle back around. Like, hey, a few minutes ago, you were telling me about your mom, and I think I kind of bypassed it. And I just want to come back around and say, I really heard how hard that is for you. So that would be an example of empathy too. We also feel really strongly that that it's really, well, it's really important that we're talking more and about assessing relationship with food and body before we're offering prescriptions or behavioral suggestions around improving or changing someone's relationship to food. And these are some of the instruments that we use on a regular basis in our office. We also think it's really important to just ask some questions about history of dieting and disordered eating and intake. There's some professions that may do this regularly, there's a lot that don't. And being clear, open, and honest in your questions can be really powerful. For instance, have you ever had a difficult relationship with food or your body? Have you had a history of eating disorder? Is there a history of eating disorder in your family? And how is that going for you now? Where are you around that? Have you had treatment for that? We can also ask some simple questions to assess how competent someone feels as an eater and how well they take care of themselves as an eater. So do you feel good about food and eating? What's the variety? What kind of foods do you like to eat? Is there a variety? Do you trust yourself around food? Do you trust yourself to eat enough for you? Do you take time to eat? Do you plan to be an eater during the day? Do you have regular meals? Do you even know what you eat? And there's also questions that can be helpful in assessing eating disorders. This is by no means comprehensive, but can kind of get you on the path if it's not something you're regularly already doing. How much time are you spending during the day thinking about food? You know, there's data to show that folks with eating disorders are thinking about food more than 80% of the day. How are you thinking about tomorrow already? How worried are you about food? Do you get a sense of does your sense of worthiness increase on a good day versus having a bad day with food? And what is a good or bad day after all? Has your quality of life decreased as the quality of your diet is increased? So is food taking up so much space in your life that other things that used to be important to you are taking a back seat, like social life or hobbies or other means of expressing or engaging in the world? And have you become stricter with yourself? Is food becoming something that you're trying to perfect or get right? And how does that impact you? And here's some more questions. Do you skip foods that you enjoy to make sure that you get the right foods in? Do you feel more guilt and self-loathing when you stray from your diet? Are you focused on eating the way you're supposed to? How do you feel when you don't?
So those, again, there's some actual assessments as well as some questions you might pose in your intake forms or in your conversations with people. Especially with, I think a lot of people probably meet the criteria for disordered eating. And then if you have people who've had a diagnosed eating disorder, these are tricky to heal from, especially while living in a dieting culture. And so it's always good, regardless of their answers, to approach things with a grain of salt, and with care, like take it with a grain of salt and be careful, because sometimes people don't know it can be hard for people to come to terms with the idea that they may have some disordered eating going on, especially around the orthorexia and people who think they're doing the right thing and living in a culture that really holds people up on a pedestal. All you have to do is be at a dinner party to hear people hold other people up on a pedestal around what they're choosing to eat and not eat. A huge part of this work is in promoting embodiment. I think Rachel Cole says the scale takes you away from yourself and giving it up brings you home. And if we as clinicians just focus on fixing and quality of food and health behaviors and lifestyle changes, we are probably just continuing to promote people being disembodied and looking to experts and leading with their heads instead of their hearts and their entire bodies. This quote made me think of something Lucy Aframore said at Health at Every Size facility training. She says, "Your body is the bomb. It's not a calorimeter." Do you remember when she said that? Your body is the bomb. It's not a calorimeter.
I think she'd be pleased to know anyone's laughing at that joke.
And we, this is, we're really seeking to eliminate this mechanistic thinking, and that turns our health into commodities. It's just more controlled discourse. Body trust is really about inward listening. It's connecting to your wise mind, a healthy voice, and intuitive eating, they call it the voice of a nurturer. And in order to drop down into the body and start to listen to it, we can't be talking about nutrition and food quality and lifestyle changes. I was for a long time worked in research in the traditional weight paradigm where we really believed we were promoting healthy lifestyles. We did not believe we were promoting dieting. Mm-hmm. It's just like, just be healthy. Just take care of yourself.
Mm-hmm. But don't diet.
But don't diet. And yet when you looked at people's food records right there, they were dieting if we were asking them to keep track of their food.
Certainly.
They were dieting, and when I left that job and discovered the dieting mind and Health at Every Size community, I was like, oh yeah, they were dieting. We could call it whatever we wanted there.
Yeah, I'm sure many people listening can relate to that story.
Yeah. I think I said earlier when we talked about nutritionism that it ignores the meaning of food. And we want to really acknowledge the meaning of food in someone's life. I remember a client that she had this ice cream thing at night and she didn't know why. And she was like pathologizing her ice cream habit at night. And I said, well, what role has ice cream played in your life? Where might ice cream have been? And she's like, well, my dad was dying of cancer. It was one of the only foods that we could enjoy together because he was so ill.
Yeah.
So eating ice cream connected her to her deceased father. And just, brought up that happier time in her life. Mm-hmm. Food is a metaphor for needs. Hunger is a need. Appetite is what we want, but hunger is a need. And so there's a lot of metaphor in food as need. It means security, family, friends. It helps us express our pride. And it brings out our basest of instincts and our highest natures. And I think sometimes clients are coming, I'm really loving this word reckoning. I think I'm trying to throw it out in every conversation I'm having these days. But that for some clients, they're reckoning with their identity as an eater. To take care of your basic food needs, acknowledges that you have needs. And to be a competent eater means that you are coming to terms with your identity as an eater and that you wake up in the morning with the acknowledgement that you are going to need food and that you have some plan for how you're going to take care of those needs. This slide has that statement I said a little bit ago, that animals feed while human beings dine, that we commune through food, and nutritionism robs people of this. We see food just as a way of promoting our health. There's a reason why there's a last meal on death row. When people are on death row, there is a last meal that they are served. And there's an art installation about this where a woman, she takes these plates, they're all the same plate, and she draws the meal that the inmate has on the plate, and she puts the name of the inmate and the date they were executed. And when we think about what these people choose for their last meals, first there's a symbolism. Why do we give people a last meal if food has no meaning? And what is it that they choose to eat as their last meal? For many of them, it's something that their grandmothers made for them. It's something that they had with their family. It's something that they had when life was better, when life was different, when it takes them back to a happier time. And so we don't want to lose sight of the meaning of food as we start to focus on nutrition. It's something we use to express love, to bring comfort and hope, to forge relationships. And so as you know, I often say, if you read the book Intuitive Eating, you'll find that the nutrition chapter is in the back of the book, and it's placed there purposefully. And I always tell my clients, when you get to the gentle nutrition chapter, stop the book, go back to the front, and rework all of that. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. When we're focusing on eating a healthy relationship with food, healing relationship with food and body, we're thinking about eating competency. How are their food caretaking skills? How often do they go to the grocery store? How do they decide what they're going to buy? How do they decide when they're going to eat? Do they consistently give their body the message that food is available? So some of that basic eating competency. Can they make do when their normal foods aren't available, their usual foods? Are they able to travel and stop at a Taco Bell if they need to eat? Or are they like, I can't eat Taco Bell, so I'm not going to eat, right? That people with eating competency can make do with what's available. A huge part of healing relationship with food, and often the first step, is to reconnect people with their internal cues of hunger and fullness. And at Be Nourished, we talk about the difference between hunger and appetite. Hunger is I need to eat. Appetite is what do I want? And we talk about the difference between being full and satisfied. We can walk away from a meal feeling full and not at all satisfied. And we can walk away from a meal feeling satisfied, like, oh, that was good, and not really full. And that there's a difference between these things. And we tend to be satisfied when we eat foods that taste good, that we like to eat. We don't eat things to suck it up and be a health martyr. And then we normalize eating. I used the word earlier. I think people pathologize their food. I often tell my clients that I'm not so concerned about what you're eating. I'm more concerned about what you think about what you're eating and what you think about what you do with food and the shames associated with it. So we work hard to neutralize food and eating, stripping it of good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, fattening, unfattening, terms. We lift the deprivation. We work on getting enough to eat while starting to welcome in foods that have typically been, left far away from the table. We start to connect with the difference between being physically hungry and emotionally hungry, and just rediscover the pleasure in eating. Ellen Satter says, when the joy goes out of eating, nutrition fails. That we want to maintain pleasure. Clients always look at me when I say, well, do you like what you're eating? And they look at me and go, well, what does that have to do with it? And I said, it has a lot to do with it. Competent eaters are confident, flexible, comfortable with eating, matter of fact about it, and they're reliable about getting enough to eat of enjoyable and nourishing foods. Ellen Satter also has a definition of normal eating, and a big part of this is, that it takes up some time and attention, but it keeps its place as only one important area of your life. And normal eating is flexible, it varies. I think when we read this definition to people, they are shocked
Mhm.
that normal eating is under eating at times, and normal eating is also overeating at times. It's
Right.
also eating for emotional reasons sometimes.
And that we're moving towards flexibility with food, not perfection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when we're ready to talk about nutrition, we talk about gentle nutrition. Again, it's in the back of the book for a very good reason. And we want to honor our taste buds. You know, that when eating healthy tastes good and it makes people feel better, they're far more likely to sustain it. And so we're thinking more about progress versus perfection. But again, usually by the time a client is ready for this, they don't really need me anymore. They can figure that piece out on their own. They can start to navigate from their own internal wisdom and what they believe makes them feel the best. And talking about nutrition too early on and the quality of food people eat too early on just kicks up the food policing voice and the nutrition informant voice, and which often prompts then the rebellious eater as well. So the last thing I think I want to talk about before we wrap up here is just if and when you do offer advice, how do we do that? You know, I think when we offer advice, one, it would be good to ask permission to do it.
Yeah, trauma-informed care involves getting consent every time that you want to intervene. Every time. How would it be for you if I did this right now? How do you feel about talking about this?
Yeah, what would it be like if I gave you some recommendations? What do you see might be some of the risks of me doing so?
If I talk to you about food right now, what might happen when you go home today?
Right. So before we give advice, just assessing what that would be like. The motivational interviewing style has this explore method where we explore up front what the person already knows, what they've tried, what would be helpful to know more about. It's a big thing when I'm sitting there wanting to give people advice, for me to not do that and to come up with a question to see if the answer's in the room. Well, what do you already know about how people do this? What would you like to know more about? And then we offer information in a neutral, non-judgmental tone. And if you've ever heard me speak about motivational interviewing, you've heard me say that as a dietitian, I was trained to overwhelm people with too much information. And so to avoid the deer in headlights phenomena as much as possible. And then on the other side of offering information is to explore the person's reactions to what they've shared, what you've shared with them. What would this be like for you? How ready are you to try something like this? What comes up for you as you even hear this? How do you react to hearing some of my thoughts around this? Just a gentle reminder that this terminology is terminology that backs people into a corner and takes away control and choice. They're very restrictive in nature terms. I don't even should movies. I say, oh, I saw this movie. You might want to see it. We really liked it. Instead of, you should see that movie. And then these are some better ways to frame it. Try talking about your patients and what they tell you. You know, some of my patients find, others find, some people say, others say, you know, you might consider. This is much softer language, which supports a person's autonomy when you do give the advice. So I think we have just one or two more slides.
We want to acknowledge that doing this work in a deeper way, in a more inclusive way, in a way that returns power to the client is more difficult and more emotional work for the provider. And so it's important to know that as you care for others, that it increases the necessity to care for yourself well. So it's important that you consider treating your own relationship with food and body as constantly evolving. And notice that as you are working with folks to increase their own resilience, that you may be tapping into your own feelings about your own emotional resilience and have a lot of good and bad days around that. We want to make sure that you're seeking experiences where you're offered opportunities to be seen and heard, whether that's in your own counseling or coaching process or with other clinicians, and that's absolutely necessary for you to be able to show up over and over again. And it's key to know that your client's progress is not a reflection of your expertise or worthiness. Readiness is is a bigger indicator about clients' progress than it is about your expertise or worthiness. And if you are moving towards doing trauma-informed care, knowing that trauma exposure requires that you get the opportunity to feel and think and express yourself on a regular basis, and that cultivating a community that can really, really support you in your work is really very important. It's actually key. Of all the providers that we work with, that's what we hear the most from people, is the need to be able to be vulnerable in community. We really appreciate your listening today, and we hope that we've offered you some things that have been helpful. Again, we invite you to take what you need and leave the rest. And know that we're here. If you haven't visited our website before, it's benourished.org, and that can be a place where we have a blog and a lot of resources. We offer services to clients. We also offer opportunities for training for providers, including some retreats and an online e-course. And also we've recently started offering a provider certification training program. If you sign up on our training page, you'll receive a short little newsletter full of tips about twice a month. Thank you so much for having us. And here's where you can find us if you need us or if you have any questions. I hope you have a good day.
Yeah, it's been fun. It was fun to dive into this material and geek out on it and put together a fun presentation. So we hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to hearing what you think. Hope you have a good day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hillary and Dana. And again, this wonderful webinar on Healthism brought to you by the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health. And we received so many wonderful nuggets. I loved all your quotes, Dana and Hillary, and I just really appreciate you taking the time to bring this important topic to light. So thank you so much, and we're signing off. Hope you'll tune in for another webinar in the future. Take care.